Hey everyone, and welcome back to your weekly Linux and open source news show. And this week we have to talk more about the age verification stuff because we have a clear divide between projects that say that they will never implement support for that and projects that start making moves to implement support for it with the expected backlash around that. We also have SteamOS being updated to support the Steam machine, meaning it might come sooner rather than later, and we have plenty of updates to a bunch of open source projects and distros that we'll talk about. And also, we've got this message from our sponsor, Proton VPN. So you all know why a VPN is a really good tool to have in your toolbox, and of course that's also true on Linux. You have to protect your privacy, and this is one of the best ways to do it. And the VPN I personally use is Proton VPN because it's fast, it's secure, it's fully encrypted, they don't keep any logs, they have servers all around the world to help you with maintaining good speeds while you're browsing the web securely. They're just fantastic. And of course, when you create your Proton VPN account, you also get access to entire suite of Proton services, including an email address, contacts, calendars, a password manager, storage space, and all of that stuff, including now a Google Docs and a Google Sheets competitor. And of course, all of that is free, but if you want, you can also subscribe to paid plans to have access to more features, more speeds, more servers, and all of that stuff. I really enjoy using Proton VPN. They've got a really good Linux client, but they work on your phones as well. They're fantastic, and as usual, the link is down in the description. Okay, so let's begin on that age verification thing, and first, GrapheneOS will apparently completely refuse to comply with age verification laws. They said on Twitter that they will remain usable by anyone in the world without having to give away any personal info, any identification, or creating any kind of account. And basically, if that means GrapheneOS cannot be distributed in certain regions of the world, then they would rather stick with their principles than compromise them for a bigger user base. This is, of course, in reaction to all those age verification laws popping up in Brazil, California, Colorado, and other places. GrapheneOS is run by a non-profit in Canada, so unless a similar law appears in Canada that mandates they implement something as an entity operating there, I think they're good. They can probably just block certain markets nominally in the meantime to avoid getting fined. Now, this might harm their recent partnership with Motorola, though, because they might want to sell their graphene-powered phone everywhere instead of restricting it to certain markets, which obviously they will have to do if GrapheneOS doesn't have any age verification features in there. I'm totally on board with GrapheneOS on this one. I think it's good to stick to your principles. I think not caving into that is intelligent. Of course, I hope this will not have negative impacts for their partnership with Motorola, because the big limitation of Graphene is the number of phones it can run on. Having more hardware available to run that Android ROM would be really good, but props to them for sticking with what they believe in. And if that means some people will have to download it and sideload it or flash it basically on their own phones using a VPN, then I don't think that's a big issue. Still on the same topic, Systemd is adding some stuff related to age verification. They are implementing a way, maybe, to support the feature for distros and developers. Now, the only thing they added here is a field in the Systemd UserDB system to add a field to enter a user's birth date, just like you could already enter your name, your address, your location. This date can only be set by admins, not by unprivileged users. It is fully optional, and it is in an optional subsystem of Systemd. It's not an API. It is not used currently to implement any blocks, any verification, or anything. It's just a field that future age verification systems can decide to use if they want to. Desktop portals, for example, could potentially make use of it, but Systemd doesn't handle any of the verification or blocks linked to that date. Someone tried to repeal that change through a merge request, but the devs of Systemd refused that demand, saying that this is not Systemd implementing age verification, it's them adding a field so that other systems can be built if other actors want to do so. And of course, Systemd isn't something that is loved by everyone, and this move definitely added onto the pile of reasons why people don't want to use it or don't want it. In the end, it's just an optional field, but it does send a signal that Systemd is willing to work with that stuff, and that's not super surprising because it is used in many distros that are shipped in enterprise context or that are being sold, and obviously they will need that support if they want to keep operating in a bunch of markets. So Systemd is letting them build something on top of it by just adding a field. It's not like they're adding age verification or anything, but it does send a signal that, yeah, they're probably going to comply. And of course, this move prompted someone to fork the entirety of systemd. This fork is called liberated systemd, and the only purpose is to remove what they call surveillance-related features, such as this date of birth field. This fork only changes 12 files just to remove the date of birth field and the ability to set it using homed. It's just a one-person project. It will very likely not amount to much, but it is more a protest against this new field being added, which, as I said, does send a signal that systemd is willing to work with these laws. Now, to dispel the misconceptions about this, a systemd developer answered a few questions for its FOSS, saying that they don't want to move towards surveillance at all, that the field they added is inconsequential for this, because in most cases, the signal that will be reported through the field is, yes, the user is over 18. On the concerns of this would open the door for future evolutions that will bring mass surveillance in the future, the developer says that they aren't at all in the realm of identity tracking right now. This is just a field that you can completely null easily if you want. You do not have to fill it. And he says that when an actual ID will be required, that's where they will draw the line and refuse to implement support. They also said that such a verification would basically be impossible to implement securely on Linux anyway. Everything would be forked instantly in a matter of seconds as a protest, which is funny because that's what happened to systemd. The dev still says that unfortunately free and open source projects will have to comply with laws that they disagree with, at least if they are, for example, a distro that has a company behind it. Other projects are freer on that regard. He says that if Linux starts ignoring regulations, fewer companies will be willing to use it or contribute to it, and for plenty of projects, without companies contributing, the projects will basically not be able to function. The dev also says he's not dealing very well with the backlash, especially since he got death threats and doxing, which obviously is fully unacceptable. Now, this is a weird one because on the one hand, I am fully against all of this age verification thing. This has nothing to do in an operating system. Governments should never be involved in that kind of stuff. This is education. You need to educate people on how to use the internet, and this education will be passed on to kids. You do need to have some kind of parental controls, and this is something that is missing from a lot of Linux desktops. This should be in there to let parents configure things easily, but that should be the end of the matter. You shouldn't have laws mandating some age verification, even if it's fully declarative for now and not an actual ID check. On the other hand, the backlash systemd got on this seems a bit overblown. They're not implementing any age verification API, they're just adding an optional field. It does send the wrong kind of message at this exact time, that's for sure, but it is no reason to send death threats or anything. That's just complete insane behavior. And to conclude on that matter, Fedora's project lead is hinting at the idea that Linux distros could make use of Apple's age verification API to comply with recent laws. He says that as he understands it, Linux-based operating systems could use what Apple implemented as the standard and add parental controls on top as part of the user creation flow to match what these laws expect of OS makers. He says that what GNOME recently added in terms of parental controls is very close to what is needed to comply, even though these laws talk in age brackets and what GNOME is working on is content-based filters, but he says that should probably still work. Now, this whole discussion started after someone posted a technical analysis of an idea basically suggesting ripping away all the kernel networking code as the base for an install for the distro and then only adding it back as a user choice. So basically the user, when they're installing the system, says, yes, I do want to go online, and then the fact that they are online is a decision made by the user, meaning it would absolve the OS manufacturer from being responsible for all that age verification stuff, because by default their install doesn't require it because there's no access to the internet. Now that's when the Fedora project lead chimed in, saying that there's no need for that and that we have the building blocks already, at least in GNOME. Now, to be noted, this is not Fedora suggesting that they will adopt any form of age verification yet. It's just saying that if need be, they could adopt the API Apple decided to use and that the building blocks are there in GNOME if you want to with the parental control stuff. Now, to begin with, why I would love to see Linux distros agree on more standards, I don't think that this very divisive issue will be where Linux distros decide to cooperate on a single standard to implement whatever API, if it's the one Apple decided to use or another one or an open source one, who cares? This is probably not what Linux distros will agree upon. Second, this is just sending the wrong message. Again, I do understand that Fedora is backed by Red Hat, and Red Hat kinda will have to comply with all these laws if they want to keep operating in a bunch of markets, but at the same time, you're basically just caving into the pressure, and if no one starts resisting this, then this will take massive proportions in the future. That's absolutely not something we want on Linux, at the very least. Now let's move on from that. Valve released an update to SteamOS, at least in preview, with support for the Steam machine. Now, there are no news on the release date or the price of that device at the time I'm recording this, but at least SteamOS seems to have the required software to run on the Steam machine, which might indicate that it is not that far off. On top of that, there are improvements to screen sharing and screencasting on Discord and OBS when using the gaming mode, so the full screen SteamOS interface. There's an update to the Arch base of the distro as well, with better variable refresh rate support, USB improvements. They're moving to a newer kernel version, although it's 6.16, so not super new. There's also the ability to wake the Steam Deck LCD with a Bluetooth device, and plenty of fixes for AMD GPUs. And on top of that, there's an update to the Plasma version that the SteamOS desktop mode uses. They're only moving to Plasma 6.4.3, which is still way behind the current version, which is 6.6. But what's interesting is that they are moving to Wayland by default for that desktop mode. They haven't removed X11, but Wayland is now the default. It's a good update. Now, SteamOS always seems to stick a few versions behind what the current version is for Plasma, for the kernel, for the Arch base that they ship. That's fine. I don't think SteamOS is really meant to be a desktop operating system, although this might create problems when the Steam machine releases, because at that point you will have a true PC with a true PC OS, and a lot of people will want to use the base system, and I don't think SteamOS is a very, very good desktop distro right now. It's a bit too old, it's a bit too locked down, and I don't really think it is suited for that use case, at least not in my opinion. It seems like LibreOffice will add a donation banner on their start screen, Thunderbird style. Version 26.8 will have that little reminder that you can donate to the project. It will only appear in the start screen of LibreOffice, so the one where you pick a template or create a new document. This is not a page everyone will see, because you can always just start each app individually and bypass that start screen. For now, it's just placeholder text and an image to test things out. They're still working on the actual text that this banner will display. And of course, when you click the donation button, you will be taken to the web page, which will let you donate to LibreOffice. Now, this has been super successful for Thunderbird. Also, the donation notification in KDE apparently has gotten a lot of love, so that's good. I don't think it's an issue. It's in the start screen. It's not like it's an ad blinking everywhere in the UI. Of course, if all open source projects start adding that, then at some point it might become annoying, and we might need a system-wide setting telling these apps to not show those banners if you want to disable that, I guess. But for now, it's not too many apps, and those are crucial major projects that heavily rely on user donations, so I am 100% fine with it. As long as it doesn't start appearing in the main UI of each app I use, I don't really have an issue with that. GNOME launched their fellowship program, and they're now accepting applications for the first round, beginning in May 2026. What this is basically GNOME funding contributors to work on stuff that is considered important to GNOME, thanks to the donations of the community through the relatively new donation page of the GNOME Foundation. So, a fellowship will be a 12-month period during which contributors can work on something that they're supposedly good at. It's not specifically contracting work, because it's not GNOME saying, hey, we need someone to work on this specific feature, we're willing to pay this amount of money. It's them saying, hey, we have this scope, you need to propose stuff that you would like to work on, we'll pick the ones we want, and we'll fund your work through that. So they're not hiring someone to work on a specific feature, they're taking calls for proposals, and they'll pick the one that they want to sponsor, basically. So the first round is focused on making GNOME more efficient and productive and more sustainable in its development. So they're looking for proposals on the build system, on continuous integration, on testing, on developer tools, on documentation, on accessibility, and all of that stuff. It's not for new features this time, but it might be in the future, of course. They are funding for at least one 12-month fellowship paid between 70 and 100,000 USD a year. Apparently, payment will depend on where you are in the world. You're not locked into a full-year application either. You can propose half-time work, part-time work, full-time work, whatever, which is why they said at least one full-time sponsorship, because if there are multiple part-time ones, then they can fund that too. I think that's interesting stuff. It's good to see GNOME reinvesting user donations into work that benefits the GNOME desktop itself, and it's also good to let people propose stuff that they're willing to work on instead of focusing on one specific feature that they want, because that means more community input on what is actually getting added. Now, it's not super exciting stuff for me personally right now, because these are not new user-facing features, but everything that helps development of GNOME get better and faster is always good for the long run. Now, Ubuntu is planning a bunch of changes in their future versions, notably for GRUB. In 26.10, so not the next version, but the one after that, they will strip GRUB to its bare minimum to increase security. They're looking at dropping support for a bunch of file systems that you could run GRUB on, like XFS, ZFS, BetterFS, and also the Logical Volume Manager, so LVM. They say those things create security issues by just increasing the potential attack surface. Ubuntu itself, as the distro, would still support these file systems for the actual install, but not for the partition where you would install the bootloader. They're also looking at removing support from GRUB for LUKS encrypted drives. This would mean that GRUB would run on the ext4 file system only, at least in its signed form that supports secure boot. You could still use GRUB unsigned on any other file system, but you would lose access to secure boot and to potential security compliance, which you might need if you use Ubuntu in an enterprise setting. They say would substantially increase security, and they're also looking at disabling all of these changes in the upgrade path, so systems are not broken when upgrading to 26.10 if you set up your system with a configuration that is no longer supported. I understand their reasoning here. The bootloader is a very often targeted piece of software when you're trying to infect or attack some kind of system, so it's good to have a smaller attack surface, but this will absolutely restrict the ability to run Ubuntu on certain systems, especially the removal of LVM support, which does help with partitioning in certain scenarios, so I'm sure some people will be very annoyed with that. For basic user systems, that's not going to change anything really. And still on Ubuntu, they published their 26.04 beta, complete with GNOME 50 and the vast number of changes it brings. We're not going to go over them. Again, go check my video on that if you want. They added the Linux kernel 7.0 and the Mesa drivers version 26, and in terms of Ubuntu specific changes, you'll get changes to the icons, notably for folders. They are now orange by default, and they'll follow the accent color you set. There are changes to the GNOME shell theme, which is now more closely aligned with the vanilla GNOME theme. Ubuntu also added control for its telemetry into the settings. You have the privacy and security page. There's now a new telemetry panel that includes what was previously in the diagnostics panel, and you now have more controls on the consent that you give or don't give to that telemetry. When you upgrade your system, Ubuntu will also prompt you for consents now, so you can say yes or no, only if you haven't already set that consent to yes or no previously. Ubuntu will also re-prompt you for consent to telemetry if they deem it necessary, so they still have the ability to pester you every 6 months, but I don't think they'll do that. There's also the removal of the repository management graphical utility from the distro, the software and updates tool. Apparently it's still installable for now, but it's not installed by default, and it's likely to fully go away in the future, and all the Ubuntu Pro stuff that lived in there has been moved to the Ubuntu Security Center. Obviously, for desktop users of Ubuntu, the big change will mostly be GNOME 50. It's a massive release, it brings a lot of stuff. Also cool to have their theme more aligned with what GNOME does, because that means less work for the Yaru theme maintainers. All in all, it's probably going to be a fine LTS release, and it's going to be an important one, because a lot of distros are going to use that as their own base. Now we have some interesting benchmarks coming, of course, from Phoronix. First, it seems that Plasma 6.6 was a pretty big release in terms of AMD performance. Phoronix performed a bunch of tests comparing Plasma 6.6 using X11 and also Wayland, and compare that to GNOME 50 using an AMD Radeon GPU on the Ubuntu 26.04 beta, and the results are quite striking. Plasma 6.6 seems to outclass GNOME 50 by a lot, a plus 47% performance difference in the average of all the tests that they ran. What's also interesting is that the Wayland version of Plasma beats its X11 version, although only by 4%. All these tests include graphics benchmarks and games, and in virtually all tests, Plasma 6.6 comes out ahead of GNOME 50 and Wayland beats X11. Phoronix is also looking at performing the same test with NVIDIA cards, so we'll see if these results hold up across different GPU vendors. But right now, it seems Plasma has the edge if you want the best performance on Linux, at least compared to the other major desktop that is GNOME. And it's cool stuff to look at, because when I did my own performance comparison back in the day between various desktop environments, I didn't find that much of a delta, at least in terms of gaming and file operations and all the like, so this means things have progressed quite a bit. I don't know what Plasma is doing to their compositor window manager, but they can keep doing it. It looks to work quite well. And Phoronix performed another of their usual benchmarks, this time to see how the Nouveau plus NVK combo was doing on the latest Linux kernel 7.0 and the latest development Mesa drivers, compared of course to the official NVIDIA drivers version 590, so not the absolute latest, because if I remember correctly, the new stable version of the NVIDIA drivers is 595. Of course, since we all know that Nouveau and NVK isn't really going to beat the official drivers yet, they also compared these newer versions to their older ones, and there are some interesting things in there. Right off the bat, of course, Nouveau plus NVK is still a very long way from delivering acceptable performance. In the average of all tests, it delivers only 38% of the performance of the official NVIDIA driver, so obviously not nearly good enough. But compared to where it was with Mesa 25.2 and the kernel 6.17, it's quite insane. It's about 3 times the performance. This was tested with an RTX 5080, and sure, it means that we're still very far from ditching the modules that NVIDIA offers for a fully integrated Mesa plus Linux kernel driver, but the progress in there is quite impressive. Plus, in a few tests, Nouveau plus NVK seems to actually beat the official NVIDIA drivers in some OpenCL related stuff. In most tests, it doesn't, it lags way behind, but the progress from the older versions from a few months to where they are now is quite impressive. 3 times the performance. If they can keep that cycle going, then they're going to surpass the NVIDIA modules in not too long. And to conclude, GitHub will now use your user data to train their AI models. Now, fortunately, this is something you can disable, but it is opt-out. So by default, everything you input when you're using Copilot on GitHub will be used to train Copilot a bit more, but you can disable it if you don't want it. It will affect paid and free users, apart from a few Copilot paid tiers from students and teachers' accounts. All the content you generated using Copilot, everything you inputted in there, all the user feedback, all the interactions will go into the model. This includes all the prompts you typed, all the code snippets you passed, all the outputs the model provided, all the context around the code that you might have described, all the comments in the code, all the documentation, all the file names, all the folder structures, all interactions including thumbs ups and thumbs down reactions on the outputs. The only thing they will not grab is content from issues, because presumably there could be some user personal info in there. They won't grab anything from the discussions on your repos, and they won't grab any code from your private repos, unless you actually use Copilot on these repos, in which case they already have all of your code and they'll keep getting it as well. All of this data will be used to train Copilot further, and all of this data can be shared with what they call GitHub affiliates, so every company at Microsoft, but potentially any other company that GitHub has a contract with that might want access to that data in the future. Now, if it wasn't clear previously, GitHub is not where you should host your code if you have any other option available to you. Fortunately, you can disable that interaction, but if you do use Copilot already, you probably don't care about all of this. Also, if you're doing a development using an AI assistant, you're probably using Anthropic, you're using Claude. You're not using Copilot because Claude is just miles ahead, apparently. So Anyway, you can disable it, but if you can move away from GitHub, I think it's a good time to do so. And it's also a good time to check out the devices made by our sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. So Tuxedo is a manufacturer of laptops and desktops that ship with Linux out of the box. They ship with their own distro, Tuxedo OS, but also with Ubuntu. And of course, since the hardware is specifically picked to work really well with Linux, you can install any distro on there. They're based in Germany, but they ship to most countries in the world, and they have a big range of computers from the more affordable laptops all the way up to gaming rigs, to gaming laptops, to workstations, anything you want. You have a lot of agency on how you can customize the insides of the device, the keyboard layout on your laptop, the logo you want engraved or no logo at all. They are really fantastic, and I only use their computers these days. I can only recommend them. So as usual, the link is down in the description. Anyway, this will conclude today's episode. As usual, you're welcome if you want to do all the usual YouTube pleasantries and all the buttons down there in the comment section and whatever. Let me know what you think about all of those age verification laws and all of that stuff, because it's a tricky mess of what's acceptable and what's not. I'm on the line of maybe nothing is acceptable when it comes to these things, but let me know what you think. Anyway, you know where all the YouTube buttons are. You have all the links down in the description. You know how things work. Thank you all for listening and or watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one next week. Bye!